In an affluent suburb of Portland, a retired architect was about to unravel a shocking family betrayal that had been years in the making. What began as a heartfelt gift at a baby shower spiraled into a web of deceit when Margaret Carson discovered her son and daughter-in-law's true intentions for the house she had designed and built with her own hands. This wasn't a story about a vulnerable senior being taken advantage of, it was about a woman who refused to be undermined by the very people she trusted most. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret Carson stood at the bay window of her craftsman home, watching autumn leaves dance across the meticulously maintained garden she had designed 30 years earlier. At 68, her hands still moved with the precision that had made her one of Oregon's most respected residential architects, though arthritis now punctuated her movements with occasional winces she tried to hide from others. The house on Evergreen Avenue was her masterpiece, 3 stories of thoughtful design incorporating elements from her travels across Scandinavia and Japan. Every corner, every beam, every window placement had been considered not just for aesthetics but for how light would play across the rooms throughout the seasons. It was more than property, it was the physical embodiment of her life's philosophy that spaces shape how people live within them. She sipped her Earl Grey tea from a handmade ceramic mug, a gift from her late husband Richard, who had passed 5 years earlier after 42 years of marriage. They had raised their only son, Daniel, in this house, watching him grow from a curious child who followed Margaret around construction sites to a successful software developer who now lived across town with his wife, Elise. The invitation to their baby shower sat on the antique writing desk in Margaret's study. Their first child, her first grandchild, was due in just 2 months. The calligraphy on the envelope was Elise's handiwork, her attention to aesthetic details one of the qualities Margaret had initially appreciated in her daughter-in-law. "You're going to be a grandmother," Margaret whispered to herself, the words still feeling foreign on her tongue. Richard would have been overjoyed to see this day. His absence left a hollow space in what should have been a complete circle of family joy. Margaret's relationship with Elise had always been cordial, if somewhat distant. Elise worked in commercial real estate, her ambition evident in how quickly she had risen to become one of the top sellers at her firm. When Daniel first brought her home 3 years ago, Margaret had noticed the way Elise's eyes had catalogued every detail of the house, not with the appreciation of someone admiring craftsmanship, but with the calculating assessment of someone determining market value. The observation had troubled Margaret briefly, but she had dismissed it as professional habit. Everyone viewed the world through the lens of their expertise. Margaret herself couldn't enter a building without analyzing its structural choices and design elements. The doorbell's gentle chime interrupted her thoughts. Through the stained glass panels flanking the front door, Margaret recognized her best friend's silhouette. "Helen, come in," Margaret said, opening the door to the woman who had been her confidante since they met at university 50 years earlier. Helen Reynolds entered with the easy familiarity of someone who had spent countless hours in this home. At 70, she remained as vibrant as the abstract paintings she created in her studio downtown, her silver hair cut in a stylish bob that framed a face lined with the evidence of a life spent laughing. "I brought lunch," Helen announced, holding up a bag from their favorite local deli. "And I want to hear all about this grand gesture you're planning for the baby shower." Margaret led Helen to the kitchen, a space designed with both functionality and comfort in mind. Sunlight streamed through skylights, illuminating the handcrafted maple cabinets and the soapstone countertops that had developed a patina over decades of use. "I've been thinking about it for months," Margaret said, retrieving plates from a cabinet. "The deed is ready. I'm giving them the lake house." Helen paused in unwrapping their sandwiches. "The entire property?" "Margaret, that's significant." The lake house in question was a 3-bedroom retreat on the shores of Lake Oswego that Margaret and Richard had purchased 20 years earlier as both an investment and a weekend escape. With waterfront access and recently updated interiors, its current market value approached $2 million. "They've been talking about wanting a larger place now that the baby is coming," Margaret explained. "Daniel grew up spending summers at that lake. I want my grandchild to have the same experience." Helen arranged their lunch on plates with the deliberate movements of someone choosing her words carefully. "Have they asked for the lake house?" "Not directly," Margaret admitted. "But Elise has mentioned several times how perfect it would be for a growing family. How they could never afford waterfront property in today's market." Helen murmured noncommittally. "And you're planning to announce this at the baby shower? In front of everyone?" Margaret nodded, taking a seat at the kitchen island. "I thought it would be a wonderful moment. A gift that transcends the usual baby clothes and strollers." Helen took a bite of her sandwich, chewing thoughtfully before responding. "And the house we're sitting in now? The one you designed? What are your long-term plans for it? The question made Margaret pause. I haven't decided yet. I'll live here as long as I can manage the stairs. Eventually, I suppose Daniel and Elise might want it too, though it's farther from their offices than where they currently live. Have they expressed interest in this house as well? Helen asked, her tone carefully neutral. Elise mentions it occasionally. How special it is, how you just can't find craftsmanship like this anymore. She's particularly fond of the master suite. Helen set down her sandwich and reached for Margaret's hand. Maggie, I'm going to ask you something as your oldest friend. Are you certain this gift is motivated purely by generosity? Or is there a part of you trying to secure Daniel and Elise's attention and affection? The question stung with its accuracy. Since Richard's death, Margaret had noticed the growing distance between herself and Daniel. The weekly family dinners had gradually reduced to monthly, then to occasional holiday gatherings. Phone calls had become shorter, less frequent. She tried not to take it personally. Daniel was building his own life, his own family, but the loneliness sometimes felt like a physical presence in the house designed for a family that no longer gathered there. Maybe a little of both, Margaret admitted. Is that so wrong? Not wrong, Helen said gently. Just worth examining. $2 million is an extraordinary gift, especially when you haven't discussed any expectations or conditions. Margaret bristled slightly. I don't want to attach strings. That's not what gifts are about. Not strings, Helen clarified. Boundaries. Understanding. When my children received their inheritance after Robert died, we had very clear discussions about what it meant. Without that, misunderstandings grow like weeds. The conversation shifted to other topics as they finished their lunch, but Helen's questions lingered in Margaret's mind after her friend departed. Was she trying to buy her way into her son's life with property? Was there an unacknowledged desperation in her generosity? That evening, Margaret sat in her study reviewing the deed transfer documents her attorney had prepared. The lake house had been a sound investment, its value tripling since she and Richard had purchased it. Transferring it to Daniel and Elise would still leave Margaret financially comfortable between her retirement savings, Richard's life insurance, and the considerable equity in her primary residence. But Helen's questions had planted seeds of doubt. Margaret picked up her phone and dialed Daniel's number, deciding a conversation before the baby's shower might be prudent. Mom? Everything okay? Daniel answered on the fourth ring, ambient noise suggesting he was in a public place. Everything's fine, dear. Do you have a moment to talk? Actually, I'm at a work thing right now. Can I call you tomorrow? Of course, Margaret said, trying to keep disappointment from coloring her voice. It's nothing urgent. Just wanted to chat before the shower this weekend. About the shower, Elise wants to know if you're still planning to bring that Swedish almond cake thing. Her boss is apparently obsessed with it. Princess Darta, Margaret corrected gently. Yes, I'll bring it. I've already ordered the marzipan. Great. Listen, I should go. Talk tomorrow? The call ended before Margaret could respond, leaving her staring at her phone with a familiar sense of having been brushed aside. Daniel hadn't called the next day, or the day after. By the time Saturday arrived, the day of the baby's shower, Margaret had decided to proceed with her original plan. The deed was tucked into a simple envelope, nestled inside a wooden box she had hand-carved with Nordic-inspired designs, a nod to their family heritage. The party was being held at Daniel and Elise's current home, a modern townhouse in a fashionable neighborhood known for its proximity to tech companies and upscale restaurants. Margaret arrived early, Princess Darta carefully balanced in her hands, to find Elise directing a small army of caterers and decorators. Actually, Elise interjected, appearing beside Daniel with perfect timing, we should probably discuss this further before finalizing anything. There are tax implications to consider, potential capital gains issues. It might make more sense to handle this as part of your overall estate plan rather than as a gift right now. The suggestion was presented as practical financial planning, but Margaret heard the subtext clearly. They wanted the lake house to remain in her name until they were ready to sell it, avoiding any tax burdens associated with the transfer. I'll speak with my attorney, Margaret said neutrally, reclaiming the wooden box. He can advise on the most sensible approach. The drive home from the baby shower felt interminable. Portland's familiar streets seemed suddenly alien, as if Margaret were seeing them through a distorted lens. By the time she pulled into her driveway, darkness had fallen, and the craftsman house that had been her sanctuary for 3 decades loomed before her with its windows glowing warmly against the night. Inside, Margaret moved through her evening routine mechanically, hanging her coat, making a cup of tea she didn't really want, checking the locks on doors and windows. In her study, she placed the wooden box containing the lake house deed on her desk and stared at it, the Nordic patterns she had carved with such hope now seeming naive. Her phone chimed with a text from Helen. "How are you doing? Want company?" Margaret considered the offer, then declined with genuine gratitude. "Not tonight. Need to think. Breakfast tomorrow?" Sleep eluded her that night. She lay in the master bedroom she had designed with Richard in mind, the eastern exposure that brought morning light to his side of the bed because he loved waking with the sun, the built-in bookshelf sized perfectly for his collection of historical nautical maps, the window seat where he had spent countless Sunday mornings reading while she sketched new designs. Something Daniel had said kept replaying in her mind. "Last Christmas, remember? When you mentioned eventually leaving us both properties." Both properties. As if her legacy had already been inventoried and allocated in their minds. As if her homes, the physical spaces she had poured her creativity and passion into, were simply assets waiting to be distributed or liquidated. Margaret rose early the next morning, the unsettled feeling from the previous day having crystallized into something sharper, more defined. Over breakfast at her favorite neighborhood cafe with Helen, she recounted the baby shower in detail, including Daniel's claim about a previous conversation regarding selling the lake house. "Do you think you might have forgotten?" Helen asked. Gently. "With everything that was happening last Christmas?" Margaret shook her head firmly. "No. I would remember a conversation about selling Richard's favorite place. The lake house was where he wanted his ashes scattered, Helen. I wouldn't forget discussing its sale." Helen sipped her coffee thoughtfully. "So either Daniel is mistaken or they've been discussing what to do with my properties without directly involving me in the conversation," Margaret finished. "Proceeding as if these decisions have already been made." "That seems presumptuous," Helen said diplomatically. "It seems calculated," Margaret corrected, a chill running through her as pieces began falling into place. Elisa's career in real estate. Her frequent comments about the Craftsman house's unique features and market value. The subtle suggestions about Margaret eventually needing single-level living as she aged. The way Elise had directed the conversation away from accepting the lake house gift toward keeping it in Margaret's name until they were ready to convert it. "I think," Margaret said slowly, "I need to reassess some assumptions I've been making about my future and my relationship with Daniel and Elise." Helen reached across the table and squeezed Margaret's hand. "Whatever you decide, I'm here. Just promise me you won't make any major decisions while you're hurt and angry." Margaret nodded, but as she drove home after breakfast, her architect's mind was already reformulating plans, reimagining possibilities, reconstructing the future she had taken for granted. The Craftsman house came into view as she turned onto Evergreen Avenue, its distinctive roofline, the stained glass accents she had commissioned from a local artist, the Japanese maple she and Richard had planted on their 10th anniversary. That now stood majestic and fully mature in the front yard. This house was more than wood and glass and stone. It was the physical manifestation of Margaret's vision, her artistry, her understanding of how spaces shape lives. She had designed it for her family, but perhaps its purpose was evolving, just as she was. Inside, Margaret moved directly to her study and opened her laptop. With decisive clicks, she navigated to her attorney's contact information and composed an email requesting an urgent appointment to discuss revisions to her estate plan and the future of both her properties. The lake house gift had been rejected. But in that rejection, Margaret had received something unexpected: clarity. And with that clarity came the first stirrings of a new blueprint, not just for her houses, but for the life she wanted to create in the years that remained to her. Margaret Carson's attorney, Robert Simmons, maintained an office in a converted Victorian in Portland's historic district. The space balanced professionalism with character, polished hardwood floors, original crown molding, and walls adorned with local artwork. At 72, Robert had been Margaret's legal counsel for over 30 years, handling everything from her business contracts to Richard's estate after his passing. "Margaret, this is unexpected," Robert said, rising from behind his antique mahogany desk as his assistant showed her in. "When I saw your email marked urgent, I was concerned." "I appreciate you seeing me on such short notice," Margaret replied, settling into the leather chair across from him. The familiar scent of old books and lemon polish brought a small measure of comfort as she prepared to discuss matters she'd never anticipated. Robert's expression grew serious as Margaret recounted the baby shower incident in detail, including Daniel's claim about prior discussions regarding selling the lake house. His brow furrowed deeper when she described Elisa's suggestion to keep the property in Margaret's name until they were ready to sell it. "So, to be clear," Robert said when she finished, "you want to revoke the lake house gift and reconsider your entire estate plan?" "Yes," Margaret confirmed, her voice steadier than she expected. "I need to protect myself and my assets while I reassess my relationship with my son and daughter-in-law." Robert nodded, making notes in a leather-bound portfolio. The good news is that the deed transfer hasn't been processed yet. We can simply halt that transaction. He looked up, his eyes kind but direct. The more complex question is what you want to do instead. Have you given that any thought? Margaret drew a deep breath. I have. I'd like to explore creating a trust for my future grandchild that would provide educational opportunities but wouldn't be accessible to Daniel or Elise. And I want to investigate options for my homes that wouldn't automatically transfer them to my son upon my death. Such as? I'm not entirely sure yet. Perhaps a foundation that would maintain the Craftsman House as a residency for emerging architects. Or donating the lake house to the conservation trust that protects the shoreline. I need to explore options. Robert removed his glasses, polishing them thoughtfully. Margaret, I've known you for 3 decades. You've always been measured and rational in your decisions. May I speak frankly? Please do. Are you certain this isn't a reaction to feeling hurt and undervalued? Disinheriting your only child is a significant step. Margaret considered his question carefully. I'm not acting impulsively, Robert. The baby shower was merely the catalyst that made me see things clearly. Daniel and Elise have been positioning themselves to liquidate both properties after my death, or perhaps sooner, if they can convince me I'm unable to maintain them. They view my homes as financial assets, not as the spaces I created with intention and care. And that changes your wishes for them? It does. Margaret sat straighter, conviction strengthening her voice. I designed these houses to be lived in, to shelter and nurture families. If Daniel and Elise only see dollar signs when they look at them, then I need to find people who will value them for what they truly are. Robert made several more notes before looking up. I'll prepare the paperwork to halt the lake house transfer immediately. For the broader estate planning changes, I suggest we take some time to research options thoroughly. This isn't a decision to rush. I agree, Margaret said. But I'd like to act quickly enough to ensure my wishes are clear and legally binding. The unspoken concern hung between them, the possibility that Daniel and Elise might challenge any changes to Margaret's estate plan if they believed she was making decisions under emotional duress or, worse, with diminished capacity. I'll also prepare documentation confirming your current mental competence, Robert added, reading her unspoken worry. Just as a precautionary measure. As Margaret drove home from the attorney's office, her phone rang through the car's speaker system. Daniel's name appeared on the dashboard display. Mom, do you have a minute? His voice sounded strained. Of course, Margaret replied, keeping her tone neutral. Is everything all right? I was going to ask you the same thing. You left the shower early yesterday, and you seemed upset. Margaret considered her response carefully. I was surprised by your reaction to the lake house gift. I didn't realize you and Elise had already made plans for it. A pause. Like I said, we've discussed this before. But that's not why I'm calling. Elise and I were talking, and we realized we might have seemed ungrateful. The lake house is incredibly generous, Mom. We just want to make sure we're making practical decisions. For Sophia's future. I understand, Margaret said, though she didn't, not really. Practical decisions are important. Exactly, Daniel sounded relieved. So we were thinking, maybe instead of transferring the deed now, you could just include it in your will. As planned? That way, you don't have to worry about the transfer paperwork or any tax implications. The suggestion confirmed Margaret's suspicions so perfectly it was almost comical. They wanted the property to remain in her name while they planned its eventual sale, avoiding any immediate financial responsibilities while securing their future claim. Actually, Margaret said, I've been reconsidering that plan. I have an appointment with Robert Simmons tomorrow to discuss some new ideas. New ideas? Daniel's voice sharpened. What kind of new ideas? Just exploring options, Margaret kept her tone light. Nothing's decided yet. Mom, don't do anything hasty. Estate planning is complicated, and emotional decisions often lead to tax problems or legal issues down the road. Maybe Elise and I should come over for dinner this week? We could discuss everything together. That won't be necessary, Margaret said firmly. Robert has handled my legal affairs for 30 years. I trust his guidance. After ending the call, Margaret sat in her parked car in the driveway for several minutes, processing the conversation. Daniel's quick pivot from dismissing her gift to suggesting she keep it in her name, but committed to them in her will, felt calculated rather than concerned. Inside the house, Margaret moved through the spaces she had designed with new awareness. The Craftsman home had been created for a family, with thoughtful touches meant for multiple generations. The window seat in the kitchen where Daniel had done homework while Margaret prepared dinner, the backyard studio where she had taught him basic woodworking, the built-in bookshelves in every room because Richard believed homes should be filled with books. Now, she tried to see it through Elise's eyes, as square footage and premium materials, as comparable property values, and potential return on investment. The thought made her physically ill. Margaret's phone chimed with a text from Helen, checking in. How did the meeting with Robert go? Fine, Margaret replied. Making progress. But something unexpected has happened. Can you come over? Within 30 minutes, Helen arrived with a bottle of wine and the steadfast friendship that had weathered 4 decades of life's complications. Margaret led her to the back porch, where the evening light filtered through the Japanese maples she had planted, strategically to create dappled shadows across the stonework. Daniel called, Margaret explained, pouring the wine into crystal glasses that had been a wedding gift. Suddenly very concerned about my estate planning. Specifically, wanting to ensure the lake house stays in my name but is earmarked for them in my will. Helen accepted her glass with a grimace. That's transparent, isn't it? Margaret took a long sip of wine. But here's what's truly unsettling. He mentioned that he and Elise have been discussing my properties and their plans for them after I'm gone. As if my death is a foregone conclusion they're actively planning around. Well, everyone dies eventually, Helen offered pragmatically. Estate planning is responsible. Estate planning is responsible, Margaret agreed. Planning the liquidation of your mother's cherished homes while she's still actively living in them is something else entirely. Helen studied Margaret over the rim of her glass. What are you going to do? I'm not entirely sure yet, Margaret admitted. But I know what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to allow my life's work to be reduced to a transaction. The following morning, Margaret awoke with purpose crystallizing within her. After her daily ritual of coffee on the back porch, she went to her study and began sketching, not architectural plans, but possibilities. On crisp white paper, she outlined options for her properties, weighing each against her values and intentions. By noon, she had formulated a plan that felt aligned with her principles. She called Robert's office to schedule another appointment, then turned her attention to something she'd been avoiding, examining her financial records for any irregularities. Richard had always managed their investments, but after his death, Margaret had taken control of their portfolio with the same methodical attention she brought to her architectural projects. Her financial advisor, Thomas Chen, had been impressed with her quick grasp of complex investment strategies and her clear-eyed approach to risk assessment. Now, Margaret logged into her accounts and began reviewing statements, transfers, and access logs. Everything appeared in order, but something made her pause, a password reset notification from 3 months earlier that she didn't recall initiating. She picked up her phone and dialed Thomas directly. Margaret, good to hear from you, he greeted her warmly. What can I do for you today? Thomas, I received a password reset notification for my investment account in February, but I don't remember requesting it. Can you tell me if anyone else has accessed my accounts? A pause. Let me check our security logs. Can you hold for a moment? Margaret waited, a knot forming in her stomach. After several minutes, Thomas returned. Margaret, there was indeed a password reset on February 18th. The request came through your authorized email address, and the security questions were answered correctly. But I didn't request it, Margaret said firmly. I see. Thomas's voice turned serious. In that case, we need to take immediate action. I'm going to lock down your accounts and issue new credentials with enhanced security measures. We should also discuss setting up additional verification protocols. After completing the security upgrades, Margaret sat at her desk, contemplating the implications. The only people who might know the answers to her security questions were Daniel and possibly Elise. The thought that they might have attempted to access her financial information sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the spring breeze coming through the open window. That evening, as Margaret prepared a simple dinner, her doorbell rang. Through the stained glass panels, she recognized Daniel's silhouette. She hesitated before opening the door, schooling her expression into one of pleasant surprise. Daniel? This is unexpected. Her son stood on the porch, looking uncharacteristically tense. Mom, can I come in? We need to talk. Margaret stepped aside, allowing him to enter the home he had grown up in but now seemed to evaluate with a real estate developer's eye. She led him to the kitchen, where the remnants of her dinner preparation, sliced vegetables, a partially assembled salad, sat on the island. Sorry to interrupt your dinner, Daniel said, though he made no move to leave. But I'm concerned about you. Oh? Margaret continued assembling her salad, keeping her hands busy. What concerns you? I got a call from Thomas Chen today, Daniel said, watching her closely. He mentioned there was some issue with your investment accounts. Something about unauthorized access? Margaret set down her knife carefully. Yes, someone attempted to reset my passwords. Thomas helped me secure everything. And you didn't think to call me about this? Daniel's tone carried an edge of injured innocence that struck Margaret as performative. Mom, if someone's trying to access your accounts, that's serious. It could be elder fraud. The irony was almost too perfect. Thomas is handling it, Margaret said simply. The accounts are secure now. Daniel leaned against the counter, his posture deliberately casual in a way that reminded Margaret of Richard when he was preparing to navigate a difficult conversation. Mom, I think we need to talk about some bigger issues. Elise and I are worried that you might be making impulsive decisions because you felt hurt at the shower. Impulsive decisions? You mentioned speaking to Robert about new ideas for your estate planning. And now there's this security issue with your accounts. It seems like, maybe you're not thinking clearly. Margaret felt a surge of indignation but kept her voice level. I'm thinking very clearly, Daniel. For perhaps the first time in several years. What does that mean? Daniel's tone sharpened. It means I've realized that my assumptions about family loyalty and shared values may have been misplaced. Margaret met her son's gaze directly. It means I'm reassessing my plans for the future based on new information. Daniel's expression darkened. What new information? That we don't want the lake house as a gift right now? Mom, that's not rejection, it's practical financial planning. Is accessing my investment accounts without my knowledge also practical financial planning? Margaret asked quietly. Daniel's face flushed, then paled. I don't know what you're talking about. Someone reset my account passwords using my security questions. The same questions whose answers only you would know. Questions about your first pet's name and the street where you grew up. This was what Daniel and Elise failed to understand. A house was not merely an asset, it was a living environment that shaped its inhabitants' experiences and preserved their memories. At 5 o'clock, Margaret began final dinner preparations. She set the dining room table with the handmade ceramic dishes she had commissioned from a local artist for her and Richard's 30th anniversary, pieces that told the story of their marriage through subtle glaze patterns and organic forms. As 6:30 approached, Margaret changed into a simple linen dress and cardigan, comfortable yet dignified attire that made her feel appropriately armored for what was to come. She applied light makeup and secured her silver hair in its usual elegant twist, studying her reflection with clear-eyed assessment. The face that looked back at her had earned its lines, laugh lines around her eyes from decades of finding joy in creation, furrows in her brow from concentration over drafting tables, softening along her jawline that spoke of years passing. But wisdom accumulating. This was not the face of someone who could be easily dismissed or manipulated. The doorbell rang precisely at 6:30. Margaret squared her shoulders and moved to answer it, reminding herself that whatever happened next, she had already secured what mattered most. Daniel and Elise stood on the porch, a practiced tableau of family harmony. Elise's baby bump was more pronounced now, showcased in a maternity dress that managed to be both professional and maternal. Daniel held a bouquet of lilies, Margaret's favorites, a detail that suggested this visit had been carefully planned. Mom, you look wonderful, Daniel greeted her with a kiss on the cheek. These are for you. Thank you, Margaret accepted the flowers with a genuine smile, their beauty transcending the complicated circumstances. Come in. Dinner is almost ready. She led them to the living room, where she had set out a cheese board and non-alcoholic drinks for Elise. As they settled into the conversation area she had designed specifically for its acoustics and sight lines, Margaret noticed how Elise's gaze continued to catalog details, lingering on the original artwork, assessing the restored hardwood floors, noting the craftsman details that made the house unique in Portland's luxury market. How are you feeling, Elise? Margaret asked, pouring sparkling water into crystal glasses. The pregnancy seems to be progressing well. Wonderfully, Elise replied, her hand moving to her stomach in what seemed a practiced gesture. Sophia is very active now. The doctor says she's developing right on schedule. Sophia, Margaret repeated the name, tasting its significance. Her granddaughter, the connection to future generations that would persist regardless of what happened tonight. It's a beautiful name. We thought so, Daniel said, accepting a glass of wine. Classic but not overly common. Like this house, actually, timeless design that stands out from the crowd. The comparison wasn't subtle, and Margaret didn't miss the strategic pivot toward discussing the property. She chose not to engage yet, instead steering the conversation toward neutral topics as they enjoyed the appetizers, Daniel's latest software project, local politics, the spring planting Margaret had completed in her garden. When they moved to the dining room for dinner, the conversation maintained its superficial pleasantness, though Margaret sensed growing impatience from both Daniel and Elise. They had come with an agenda, and the small talk was merely preamble. As Margaret served the salmon, perfectly cooked, presented on the handmade plates that carried decades of family meals within their glazed surfaces, Daniel finally broached the subject they had come to discuss. "Mom, there's something Elise and I wanted to talk to you about," he began, his tone shifting to what Margaret recognized as his business voice, the carefully modulated authority he used when negotiating contracts or managing difficult clients. "Of course," Margaret replied, taking her seat at the head of the table, the position she had occupied for 40 years of family dinners. "What's on your mind?" Daniel and Elise exchanged a glance that confirmed their coordination. "We've been thinking a lot about family lately, obviously," Daniel continued, gesturing toward Elise's pregnancy. "About legacy and security and planning for the future." "Natural considerations for new parents," Margaret acknowledged, serving herself a portion of roasted vegetables. "Exactly," Elise joined in, her real estate professional's voice smooth and persuasive. "And in that spirit, we've been doing some research about options that might benefit everyone in the family, including you, Margaret." "What kind of options?" Margaret kept her tone neutral, curious rather than defensive. Daniel set down his fork, a signal that the conversation was shifting from dinner pleasantries to business proposition. "We've been looking into senior living communities that specialize in supporting active, independent residents while providing increasing levels of assistance as needed." Margaret maintained her composure, though the direction was exactly as she had anticipated. "I see. And what prompted this research?" "I'm not experiencing any difficulties living independently." "Of course not," Elise interjected quickly. "You're incredibly capable, Margaret. This isn't about current needs, it's about planning ahead thoughtfully. We found a beautiful community in Lake Oswego," Daniel continued, pulling a glossy brochure from his jacket pocket and placing it on the table beside Margaret's plate. "It's called Evergreen Shores. They have independent cottages on landscaped grounds, a full calendar of cultural activities, studio spaces for artists and crafters, and progressive care options if they ever become necessary." Margaret glanced at the brochure without touching it, noting the manicured grounds and smiling seniors engaged in pottery and painting. "It looks lovely. For someone who needs that environment." "Mom, this isn't about need right now," Daniel's voice carried a hint of frustration beneath its practiced patience. "It's about making transitions on your own terms, before circumstances force more difficult decisions." "What circumstances are you anticipating?" Margaret asked directly. Another glance between Daniel and Elise, a micro-expression of shared strategy that Margaret might have missed if she hadn't been watching for it. "No one can predict the future," Elise offered diplomatically. "But transitioning while you're healthy and fully independent means you would have complete control over the process. You could select exactly the living space you want, establish yourself in the community while you're energetic enough to build new friendships, and approach the change as an exciting new chapter rather than a necessity." The sales pitch was skillful, framing institutional living as empowerment rather than diminishment. Margaret wondered how many elderly property owners Elise had guided through similar conversations in her real estate career. "And what would happen to this house if I were to make this transition?" Margaret asked, though she already knew the answer. "Well," Daniel said, his tone lightening with rehearsed casualness, "that's actually the elegant part of the plan we've been developing. This property could be sold to finance your entry fee and ongoing expenses at Evergreen Shores, potentially with significant proceeds remaining for your future security or legacy planning." "I see," Margaret took a sip of wine, using the moment to maintain her composure. "And who would manage this property sale?" "I would, of course," Elise answered immediately. "I'd ensure you received maximum value, handle all the complicated paperwork, and coordinate everything so you wouldn't have to worry about any details." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "And the lake house? Would that also need to be sold to finance this transition?" "Not necessarily," Daniel replied, though his slight hesitation revealed the prepared script hadn't accounted for this direct question. "That property could remain in the family for now. Though eventually, as we discussed, converting it to more practical assets might make sense for everyone." The entire scenario unfolded exactly as Margaret had suspected, a coordinated effort to move her into institutional living while liquidating her properties. The fact that they presented it as a gift, as something they were doing for her benefit rather than their own financial interests, was perhaps the most insulting aspect. "This is certainly a comprehensive plan," Margaret said after a measured pause. "How long have you been developing it?" "Just recently," Daniel answered quickly, too quickly. "Since the baby shower, really. We realized we needed to think more holistically about the future." "I see," Margaret set down her fork and folded her hands in her lap. "And does this holistic thinking include accessing my investment accounts without my knowledge?" The question landed like a stone dropped into still water, ripples of shock visibly moving across both their faces. Daniel recovered first, his expression shifting from surprise to concerned innocence. "Mom, what are you talking about? No one has accessed your accounts." "Someone requested a password reset using my personal security information," Margaret stated calmly. "Someone answered questions about your childhood pet and the street where you grew up." Thomas Chun confirmed the breach attempt. "That's disturbing," Elise interjected, her professional composure quickly reasserting itself. "Identity theft targeting seniors has become increasingly common. Perhaps we should help you set up additional security measures." "That won't be necessary," Margaret replied. "Mom, Elise went into labor. I thought you should know." The message itself was a peace offering of sorts, the first direct communication since the night they had walked out of her dining room with threats of legal action. "Would you like me to come to the hospital?" Margaret had asked carefully, hope and apprehension tangled in her chest. A pause, then, "Yes. I think that would be good." Now she waited, watching the elevator doors for her son's appearance. Their lawyers had exchanged multiple letters over the past 12 weeks, formal communications outlining potential challenges to her estate revisions, followed by Robert's calm but firm responses detailing the extensive documentation supporting Margaret's decisions. The threatened lawsuit had not materialized, perhaps because Daniel and Elise's legal counsel had advised them of the slim chances for success, or perhaps because the impending birth had shifted their focus from future inheritances to immediate family concerns. The elevator doors opened, revealing Daniel looking simultaneously exhausted and exhilarated, the unmistakable appearance of a new father. Margaret stood, clutching the gift bag, unsure of the appropriate greeting after months of strained silence. "Mom," Daniel acknowledged, his voice softer than she expected. "Thanks for coming. How is everyone?" Margaret asked, maintaining the careful distance between them. "Healthy. Sophia arrived at 3:17 this morning. 7 pounds, 4 ounces. Pride infused his voice despite the lingering tension. "Elise is resting. It was a difficult delivery." "I'm glad they're both well," Margaret said sincerely. "I brought something for Sophia." Daniel glanced at the gift bag with an unreadable expression. "You can come see them, if you'd like. Elise is awake." Margaret followed her son through hospital corridors that smelled of disinfectant and new beginnings. She had visited this same maternity ward 39 years earlier, when Daniel himself had entered the world after 22 hours of labor. Richard had been there then, his steady presence a counterbalance to her exhaustion, his quiet joy at becoming a father etched permanently in her memory. Room 427 had a small whiteboard outside the door with "Baby Girl Carson" written in cheerful blue marker. Daniel knocked softly before entering, an intimacy in the gesture that reminded Margaret of the countless ways family relationships operated through unspoken signals and understood boundaries. Inside, Elise reclined against pillows on the hospital bed, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, her face makeup-free and bearing the unmistakable combination of fatigue and wonder that accompanied new motherhood. In her arms, wrapped in a standard hospital blanket, was a tiny form with a shock of dark hair. "Margaret," Elise acknowledged, her tone neutral rather than hostile. "Progress, perhaps, from their last encounter." "Congratulations," Margaret said simply, remaining near the doorway until invited further. "Daniel says everyone is healthy." "Yes," Elise's gaze returned to the bundle in her arms, maternal pride momentarily superseding the complicated dynamics between the adults. "She's perfect. Would you like to meet your granddaughter?" Daniel asked, the question carrying weight beyond its simple words. Margaret moved forward cautiously, approaching the bedside with the reverence the moment deserved. As Elise adjusted the blanket to reveal Sophia's face, Margaret felt her breath catch. The tiny features held echoes of Daniel as a newborn, the same determined brow, the same bow-shaped upper lip, but there was something entirely unique about this new person, this continuation of family that transcended property disputes and estate plans. "She's beautiful," Margaret whispered, emotion tightening her throat. "Truly beautiful. Would you like to hold her?" Elise offered unexpectedly. The question seemed to surprise Daniel as much as it did Margaret. "Are you sure?" he asked his wife quietly. Elise nodded, her expression unreadable. She should meet her grandmother. The transfer was accomplished with careful hands and murmured instructions. Then, suddenly, Margaret was cradling her granddaughter, the familiar weight of newborn life bringing back a flood of memories from Daniel's infancy. Sophia's eyes opened briefly, unfocused newborn blue, before closing again. In the serene sleep of the newly arrived. "I brought something for her," Margaret said softly, reluctant to disturb the peaceful bundle. "It's in the bag." Daniel retrieved the gift bag, removing the tissue paper to reveal the blanket. His expression changed as he recognized the architectural patterns, elements from both the craftsman house and the lake house woven into the design. "You made this?" he asked, running his fingers over the intricate stitches. "Yes," Margaret confirmed. It seemed important that she have something connecting her to those places, even if circumstances are different than I once imagined. Daniel's eyes met hers, something shifting in his expression. "It's beautiful work, Mom. Really beautiful." "It's a family tradition, actually," Margaret explained, gently rocking Sophia as she spoke. "My grandmother made a blanket when I was born. I made one for you." It felt right to continue that for Sophia. The moment held a fragile potential for reconciliation, not an erasing of the conflict that had emerged, but perhaps the beginning of a new understanding built on the foundation of this tiny new life they all cherished. The hospital room door opened as a nurse entered to check Elisa's vital signs, breaking the delicate connection. Margaret carefully returned Sophia to Elisa's arms, stepping back to allow the medical professional access to the new mother. "I should go," Margaret said, recognizing that both Elise and Daniel needed rest more than they needed to navigate complicated family dynamics. "But I'm so glad I could meet her." "Thanks for coming, Mom," Daniel said, walking her to the door. In the hallway, out of Elisa's hearing, he added, "This doesn't resolve everything, but it's a start, maybe." "I'd like that," Margaret replied honestly. She deserves to have her family united, whatever that looks like going forward. Outside the hospital, Portland's summer sunshine felt symbolic, warming but not burning, illuminating but not blinding. Margaret walked to her car with measured steps, processing the significance of what had just occurred. Not a full reconciliation, certainly, but an acknowledgement of the bonds that existed beyond property and inheritance. When she arrived home, Margaret found Helen waiting on the front porch, a bottle of champagne and 2 glasses prepared for either celebration or consolation, depending on how the hospital visit had unfolded. "Well?" Helen asked as Margaret climbed the porch steps. "She's perfect," Margaret said, settling into the Adirondack chair beside her friend. 7 pounds, 4 ounces. Dark hair like Daniel had. And they let me hold her. "That's significant," Helen observed, popping the champagne cork with practiced efficiency. "Given how things stood the last time you saw them." "It felt like a possible beginning," Margaret agreed, accepting a glass of bubbling wine. Not forgiveness exactly, but recognition that some connections matter more than the conflicts surrounding them. They toasted the birth quietly, the afternoon sunlight filtering through maple leaves to create dappled patterns across the porch planks. After a companionable silence, Helen asked the question Margaret had been contemplating during her drive home. "So what happens now? With the legal situation, I mean." Margaret sipped her champagne thoughtfully. "I don't know. Nothing was said explicitly. But the fact that they called me, that they wanted me there, it suggests they might be reconsidering the lawsuit threat." "Babies have a way of shifting perspectives," Helen noted. "Suddenly the future seems more important than the past. And more pressing than property values," Margaret added with a small smile. That evening, as Margaret prepared for bed, her phone chimed with a text message from Daniel, the first direct, non-emergency communication since their confrontation. Attached was a photo of Sophia wrapped in the architectural blanket, her tiny face peaceful in sleep. The message read simply, "She seems to like your gift. We're coming home tomorrow. Maybe you could visit this weekend?" Margaret sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the image of her granddaughter nestled in the blanket she had created stitch by stitch over the past months. Each pattern element represented a specific architectural feature from the houses that had become the center of their family conflict: the craftsman porch columns, the lake house dormers, the distinctive window shapes from both properties interlocked in a design that spoke to continuity rather than division. She texted back, "I would love that. Just let me know when would be convenient." Setting down her phone, Margaret moved to the window that overlooked her garden, the mature trees and thoughtfully arranged plantings that had grown alongside her life in this house. The properties that had become points of contention were ultimately just physical manifestations of something deeper, her desire to create and preserve spaces that nurtured human connection and creativity. Perhaps, she reflected, there were ways to honor that intention that didn't require rigid control over the future of the physical structures themselves. Perhaps what mattered most was ensuring that the principles behind their design, the values they embodied, could be transmitted to future generations, even if the buildings eventually passed into other hands. 3 days later, Margaret stood on Daniel and Elise's doorstep, a basket of practical new parent supplies in one hand and a portfolio tucked under her arm. The townhouse looked different somehow, less like a staged real estate property and more like a genuine home, with the subtle signs of new parenthood evident in the baby swing visible through the front window and the stroller parked in the entryway. Daniel opened the door, the shadows under his eyes testifying to the sleep deprivation of early fatherhood. "Mom, come in." Elise is feeding Sophia in the living room. The atmosphere carried a tentative warmth, not the easy closeness they had once shared, but not the icy hostility of their last encounter either. Margaret followed Daniel into the living room, where Elise sat in a new rocking chair, Sophia cradled against her chest. "Margaret," Elise acknowledged, her tone neutral but not unwelcoming. "Thank you for coming. How are you feeling?" Margaret asked, setting down her gifts and taking a seat on the sofa across from the new mother. "Exhausted. Overwhelmed. Amazed." Elise's answer held an unexpected honesty. "I had no idea it would be this intense." "No one does," Margaret said with a small smile. "It's impossible to understand until you're in it." The conversation moved through safe topics: Sophia's feeding schedule, the pediatrician's assessment, the meals friends had arranged to deliver. The practiced civility gradually softened into something more genuine as they united around the common ground of caring for this new life. When Sophia fell asleep after feeding, Elise carefully transferred her to the bassinet position near the sofa. "She's sleeping in shorter bursts than the book suggested," she confessed, arranging a light blanket over the sleeping infant. "Daniel was the same way," Margaret offered. "We tried everything, driving him around the block, running the vacuum cleaner, the clothes dryer. Finally, we discovered that he would sleep soundly if we put him in his bassinet on the porch. Something about the outdoor sound soothed him." Daniel looked up with surprise. "I don't think you ever told me that before." "There are probably 1,000 stories about your early days that never came up," Margaret said. "That's part of what I wanted to talk with you both about today." She reached for the portfolio she had brought, opening it to reveal architectural renderings, detailed plans for both the craftsman house and the lake house, annotated with handwritten notes. "What are these?" Daniel asked, leaning forward to examine the drawings. "The original design plans for both houses," Margaret explained. "With all my notes about why specific choices were made, why the kitchen windows face east to catch morning light, why the master bedroom has built-in bookshelves positioned to create a reading nook, why the lake house dock extends at that particular angle to maximize sunset views while minimizing shoreline impact." Elise studied the renderings with professional interest despite herself. "These are extraordinary detailed." "Architecture isn't just about creating structures," Margaret said. "It's about designing experiences, anticipating how people will move through spaces, how light and sound will affect their emotions, how the physical environment shapes their interactions and memories." She turned to another page, revealing photographs of the houses under construction, including images of Richard and a young Daniel assisting with various projects. "These places aren't just valuable because of their market price. They're valuable because of the intentions behind them and the memories they contain." Daniel traced a finger over a photo of himself at about 8 years old, helping Richard install the porch railing on the craftsman house. "I remember this day," he said softly. "Dad let me use the level. I was so proud to be helping." "That's what I wanted to preserve," Margaret explained, her voice gentle but firm. "Not just the physical structures, but the philosophy behind them. When you and Elise talked about selling the properties as if they were simply financial assets, it felt like that deeper value was being erased." Elise shifted in her seat, her expression guarded but thoughtful. "I understand that these houses mean more to you than just their market value. But they're still physical assets that have financial implications for the family's future." "Yes, they are," Margaret acknowledged. "And that's why I've been reconsidering my approach to their preservation." Daniel's attention sharpened. "What do you mean?" Margaret drew a deep breath, organizing her thoughts carefully. "I've been working with Robert on a revised plan. One that would still protect the architectural and historical significance of the houses, but would also acknowledge your family's connection to them." She turned to another page in the portfolio, revealing legal documents with highlighted sections. "This is a draft of a new arrangement. The craftsman house would still become a residency for emerging architects after my lifetime, but with a provision that allows family members to stay there for up to 2 months each year if desired. The lake house would be placed in a conservation easement that preserves the shoreline and traditional design elements, but would allow Sophia to inherit it with certain usage restrictions." Daniel and Elise exchanged glances, absorbing this unexpected shift. "Why the change?" Elise asked directly. "Meeting Sophia," Margaret answered honestly. Holding her made me realize that preserving my architectural legacy shouldn't come at the expense of my family legacy. Both matter. The challenge is finding a balance that honors both. And the financial implications? Elise pressed, her real estate professional's mind naturally focusing on that dimension. The conservation easement would reduce the market value of the lake house significantly, Margaret explained, but would provide substantial tax benefits. And the craftsman house arrangement includes a stipend for family members who serve on the residency program selection committee, a position I'd hope one of you might consider taking. The proposal wasn't simple charity or capitulation. It represented a thoughtfully constructed compromise that acknowledged both Margaret's desire to preserve her architectural vision and the family's legitimate interest in their inheritance. More importantly, it created roles for Daniel and Elise that invited their participation rather than excluding them. This is a lot to process, Daniel said after studying the documents. We'd need to review everything with our attorney. Of course, Margaret agreed. This is just a starting point for discussion. But I wanted you to understand that meeting Sophia has shifted my perspective. I still believe these houses deserve to be preserved for their architectural significance. But I also believe they should continue to shelter family connections and memories. From the bassinet came a small sound, not quite a cry, but a stirring that suggested Sophia was awakening. Elise moved to check on her daughter, lifting her gently when she found her eyes open. Would you like to hold her? Elise asked Margaret, the offer carrying significance beyond the simple words. As Margaret cradled her granddaughter, feeling the perfect weight of new life in her arms, she recognized that true legacy wasn't just about buildings or bank accounts. It was about the values transmitted from one generation to the next, the principles that guided decisions, the capacity to evolve and adapt while maintaining core commitments. I designed these houses to nurture family, Margaret said softly, looking down at Sophia's alert gaze. That hasn't changed. What has changed is my understanding of how that nurturing might continue into the future. The conversation that followed wasn't easy. There were difficult questions about financial details, legal implications, and practical implementation of Margaret's proposed compromise. But the tone remained respectful, the shared focus on finding solutions rather than assigning blame or defending positions. By the time Margaret prepared to leave 3 hours later, no final decisions had been made, but a framework for continued discussion had been established. Daniel walked her to the door, pausing on the threshold in a moment of private conversation. Mom, I want you to know something, he said, his voice low enough that Elise couldn't hear from the living room. I never accessed your accounts to check balances. Margaret studied her son's face, seeing the boy he had been beneath the man he had become. Then who did? Daniel's expression tightened. Elise has a friend in banking. She asked for a favor. Just to confirm what resources might be available for estate planning purposes. I didn't know until after it happened, and I didn't approve. But I didn't stop it either, and I should have. The admission wasn't complete exoneration, but it was an important piece of clarity, an acknowledgement of boundary violations that had occurred even as it redistributed responsibility. Thank you for telling me, Margaret said simply. We got caught up in seeing the houses as assets, Daniel continued. Especially after Elise's parents offered the Dunthorpe down payment. Suddenly everything became about financial positioning, and we lost sight of what these places really mean to you. To all of us. We all got caught up in different perspectives, Margaret acknowledged. I was thinking about architectural legacy without fully considering your family's future security. You were thinking about financial assets without fully honoring the intention behind the designs. Maybe we can find middle ground, Daniel suggested, echoing the theme of the afternoon's discussion. That's ridiculous, Daniel said, but his eyes shifted away from hers. Anyone could find that information online these days. Social media, public records, it was probably some random hacker. Perhaps, Margaret conceded, though she didn't believe it for a moment. Either way, my accounts are secure now, and I'm making some changes to ensure they stay that way. What kind of changes? Daniel's voice carried a note of alarm. Just sensible precautions, Margaret said, deliberately vague. Nothing for you to worry about. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, that gesture so like Richard's that it made Margaret's heart ache despite everything. Mom, I think you're overreacting to what happened at the shower. Elise and I were just surprised. We never meant to hurt your feelings. This isn't about hurt feelings, Daniel. It's about recognizing patterns of behavior and responding appropriately. Margaret resumed chopping vegetables, the rhythmic motion calming her. Now, would you like to stay for dinner? I'm making enough for two. The abrupt shift threw Daniel off balance, exactly as Margaret had intended. No, I should get back. Elise is waiting. Of course, Margaret nodded pleasantly. Give her my best. After Daniel left, Margaret abandoned any pretense of Appetite. She moved to her study and placed a call to Robert Simmons, who answered despite the evening hour. Robert, I need to accelerate our timeline. Someone attempted to access my financial accounts, and Daniel just showed up acting concerned about my impulsive decisions. That's concerning. Robert's voice carried the measured caution of a man who had seen similar situations throughout his long career. Are you worried they might be building a case regarding your competence? The thought has crossed my mind, Margaret admitted. Daniel specifically mentioned that I might not be thinking clearly. Then we need to act decisively, Robert said. I'll have the capacity assessment scheduled for tomorrow. Once that's documented, we can proceed with the estate changes with a strong legal foundation. The following week passed in a blur of appointments and planning. Margaret met with Dr. Eleanor Park, a geriatric specialist who conducted a thorough cognitive assessment and documented Margaret's clear capacity for complex decision-making. She conferred with financial advisors about restructuring her assets, consulted with the Lake Oswego Conservation Trust about potential future donations, and researched foundations that supported emerging architects. Throughout this process, Daniel called daily, each conversation a careful dance around his growing awareness that something significant was changing. Elise sent texts filled with baby updates and casual inquiries about Margaret's activities. A sudden interest in her mother-in-law's daily life that felt strategic rather than genuine. 10 days after the baby shower, Margaret sat in Robert's office reviewing the final documents that would reshape her legacy according to her revised vision. Everything appears to be in order, Robert said, sliding the signature pages toward her. Once you sign, the lake house transfer will be officially cancelled, your investment accounts will be protected by the new trust structure, and your revised will ensures your properties will be managed according to your explicit wishes after your lifetime. Margaret took the pen he offered, its weight substantial in her hand. And Daniel can't challenge these arrangements? The medical documentation of your capacity is extremely thorough. Dr. Park's assessment specifically notes your ability to understand complex financial and legal concepts, make reasoned decisions, and articulate clear rationales for your choices. That, combined with the evidence of potential financial impropriety with your accounts, creates a very strong case that these changes are both necessary and made with full competence. Margaret signed her name on each designated line, her architect's hand steady and precise. With each signature, she felt a mixture of sadness and resolution, mourning the relationship with her son she had believed in, while affirming her right to protect the legacy she had built. What happens now? She asked as Robert gathered the signed documents. Now we implement these changes. The trusts will be established, the legal notifications will be processed, and your assets will be restructured according to your instructions. He looked at her with compassion. And then you continue living your life, Margaret. These protections are in place so you can focus on what matters to you without fear. What matters to me? The phrase echoed in Margaret's mind as she drove home through Portland's afternoon traffic. For decades, what had mattered most was family, creating spaces for them to thrive, planning for their security, nurturing their connections to places and memories. Now, she needed to redefine what truly mattered when those family bonds had revealed themselves to be conditional. At a stoplight, Margaret's phone chimed with a text from Daniel. Mom, Elise and I would like to come over for dinner tomorrow night. Important family matters to discuss. Please say yes. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. Had someone at the bank mentioned the trust restructuring? Had Robert's office inadvertently revealed the appointment schedule? Or was Daniel simply sensing the shift in her demeanor and actions? Whatever the cause, Margaret recognized the dinner invitation for what it was, an attempt to gauge how much she knew and what she planned to do about it. She typed a simple reply, that would be lovely. 6:30? As she pulled into her driveway, Margaret noticed Helen's car already parked on the street. Her friend sat on the front porch swing, a bottle of wine and 2 glasses set on the small table beside her. I had a feeling you might need company tonight, Helen said as Margaret climbed the porch steps. Robert's office called to confirm. Your documents were finalized. I figured that warranted either celebration or commiseration, depending on how you're feeling. Margaret settled onto the swing beside her oldest friend, accepting the glass of ruby red wine with gratitude. Both, I think. I'm relieved it's done, but sad it was necessary. Have you told Daniel yet? No, but he and Elise want to come for dinner tomorrow night. I suspect they've realized something's changing, even if they don't know exactly what. Helen swirled her wine thoughtfully. How do you think they'll react? Margaret gazed out at the Japanese maple in her front yard, its delicate leaves catching the evening light. Poorly, I imagine. No one likes discovering their plans have been disrupted, especially when those plans involved other people's assets. Will you be okay facing them alone? I could come over, be moral support. Margaret considered the offer, then shook her head. No, this is something I need to handle myself. But thank you. They sat in companionable silence as the evening shadows lengthened across the porch, the craftsman house behind them solid and enduring, a testament to Margaret's vision and skill. Whatever tomorrow's confrontation might bring, Margaret had secured her legacy on her own terms, ensuring that the spaces she had created with such care would continue to serve their intended purpose, nurturing creativity, fostering community, and preserving beauty for generations to come. The sun slipped below the horizon, casting the porch in twilight. Margaret sipped her wine and allowed herself to feel, for the first time in weeks, not just the sharp edge of betrayal but also the quiet strength of self-determination. She had built these houses with her own hands and mind. Now she had protected them the same way, deliberately, thoughtfully, and with absolute clarity of purpose. The morning of the dinner with Daniel and Elise dawned bright and clear, the kind of perfect spring day that showcased Portland at its most beautiful. Margaret rose early, her night having been punctuated by periods of wakefulness as she rehearsed the coming conversation in her mind. After her morning coffee on the back porch, a ritual that had sustained her through the darkest days after Richard's death, she began preparations for the evening with methodical precision. The menu she planned was deliberate: Richard's favorite salmon with dill sauce, roasted spring vegetables, and sourdough bread from the local bakery they had frequented as a family. For dessert, Swedish princess cake, the same princess tarta she had brought to the baby shower. Every element a subtle reminder of family traditions and shared history that Daniel and Elise seemed so willing to discard. At noon, Margaret received a call from Robert. "I wanted to check in before your dinner tonight," he said, his voice carrying the careful concern of someone who had witnessed family conflicts escalate beyond repair. "Are you prepared for potential confrontation?" "As prepared as I can be," Margaret replied, adjusting a vase of freshly cut tulips from her garden. "I'm not looking forward to it, but avoiding the conversation won't change anything." "Remember, you're on solid legal ground," Robert assured her. "Everything has been properly documented and executed. They have no recourse to challenge your decisions." After the call, Margaret moved through the house with renewed purpose, not just preparing for dinner but reinforcing her connection to the space she had created. She ran her fingers along the custom millwork she had designed, adjusted the placement of artwork selected to complement the natural light at different times of day, and opened windows to allow spring breezes to circulate through rooms positioned to maximize cross-ventilation. This mindful engagement with her home, appreciating its intentional design rather than its market value, centered her in preparation for the I believe we can," Margaret agreed. "If we're willing to listen to each other's priorities with genuine openness." As she drove home through Portland's tree-lined streets, Margaret felt a cautious optimism taking root alongside the hard one wisdom of the past months. The relationship with her son and daughter-in-law had been fundamentally altered by the conflict over her properties, and complete restoration to their former dynamic seemed unlikely. But perhaps something new could emerge, a more honest connection based on mutual respect rather than unexamined assumptions. Back at the craftsman house, Margaret moved through rooms designed with intention, touching doorframes and window seats that had witnessed decades of family life. She had created these spaces to shelter connections between people, to foster creativity and peace, to provide both sanctuary and stimulation. Those purposes remained valid, regardless of who might eventually own the physical structures. In her study, Margaret opened her laptop and began a new document titled Design Philosophy, Notes for Sophia. Into it, she poured the principles that had guided her architectural work, the belief that physical environments shape human experience, that thoughtful design could nurture both independence and connection, that beauty and function were not opposing values but complementary aspects of truly successful spaces. This, she realized, was the legacy that mattered most, not the buildings themselves, but the thinking behind them. If she could transmit these principles to her granddaughter, then the essence of what she valued would continue, regardless of what eventually happened to the physical properties. The summer evening light streamed through windows positioned to capture its golden quality. Margaret paused in her writing to appreciate how the illumination moved across surfaces she had specifically selected for their ability to reflect and diffuse natural light. This mindfulness about environment, this attention to how spaces affected human experience, was the true gift she had to offer future generations. Her phone chimed with a text message from Daniel. "We've reviewed your proposal with our attorney. There's potential here. Can we meet next week with both legal teams to discuss details?" Margaret smiled at the formal tone, so different from the casual family communications of the past, but appreciated the clear step toward resolution. She texted back, "Yes. I'll have Robert contact your attorney to arrange." Setting down her phone, Margaret returned to her writing, adding a new section addressed directly to the infant who had shifted the entire family dynamic. Sophia, houses can be bought and sold, their ownership transferred, their purposes changed. But the principles behind thoughtful design, the intention to create spaces that nurture human connection and creativity, those transcend any single structure. That's the true inheritance I hope to share with you. Outside, Portland's summer evening settled into twilight, the craftsman house standing solid and intentional against the changing light, a physical manifestation of Margaret's belief that spaces shaped lives, but ultimately, it was the values behind those spaces that constituted the most enduring legacy. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.